Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 34 of the podcast. As always, I'm your host, Melissa, and joining me again this week is Puneeta Chitwell-Varma. She is a better food advocate and the voice behind the website Maple and Marigold. Thanks for coming back, Puneeta.
Thanks for having me back. This is so much fun to talk to you, right, Melissa, and your audience.
I am having a great time. So today we're going to be diving into something that is much more your area of expertise than it is mine, and I'm excited to talk about it. But we're going to be talking about how to get some extra exposure and media for your creative business, whether you are an artist, a maker, a creative services provider, or a digital content creator like Puneeta is, through television segments, radio segments, and even print interviews. So I have a little experience doing print interviews and radio interviews, but Puneeta has a wealth of TV segment experience. She has appeared on Global News, CBC, and you have a regular segment on CHCH that I think you do monthly. Is that right?
Yes, I've been going back on CHCH and talking to Annette Hum, who's one of the anchors, the main anchor for CHCH Morning Live. And we end up talking about things that are close to my heart, food and sustainability and a little bit of what's going on in the world. So it's been an exciting ride for sure.
It's a very different world. I am terrified of television, or I don't like being on camera. So that is an area I've never been a part of, but it's something that you have really focused on in the last year. And I believe by the time this podcast interview airs, you will actually have also appeared on The Social, which is one of the major daytime talk shows in Canada. It's kind of like Canada's answer to The View, I guess. Would that be appropriate to say?
Very much so. And it's led by these four powerhouse women.
Yes.
who have such different points of view, and it's amazing to watch. I've been a lover, a watcher, for want of a better word, of The Social for years. In fact, some friends and I, we applied for tickets for the audience a few years ago, and it was such an amazing experience. And then, yes, last week I recorded my first segment for The Social to be aired on October 15th. It's on warming drinks for the fall and winter time.
My favorite.
And it was such an amazing experience, I have to say.
That's fantastic. Funnily enough, as I was thinking about this morning, my original co-host, those of you who've been listening to since the beginning will remember that Lisa Bolton was my original co-host through the first 20 episodes. And she has actually appeared on The Social and the Marilyn Dennis Show a couple of times with her cookbook. So one of the things I think with TV appearances, and even to a lesser extent radio and print interviews, is I think a lot of us think that they're unattainable. And they're really not. So I don't watch daytime TV, generally speaking. The one time where I do watch it is when I go to the dentist. They flip you back and you watch the TV on the ceiling. And they always have daytime TV shows on while you're sitting there. Mm-hmm. And virtually every time I go to the dentist and watch one of those, I see a segment with somebody I know from the food blogging world. So it's not as unattainable as you think. And that's one of the things we're going to be talking with Puneeta about today, because this is something that I think you made a concentrated effort to try and do more in the last year or two.
Yes. So I actually, at the beginning of 2019, I figured out that if I wanted to reach an audience that was not limited to the Maple and Marigold audience, because that's, as bloggers, we start out by writing about what we feel strongly about, and then we write on our own platform, and then slowly you start expanding your reach and connecting with other writers and other bloggers and people who may not necessarily be in your own writers community, but reaching people outside of that. And so I had been blogging, writing for years, creating content, videos, social media. So I had been doing that for a few years. And then There was a shift within me, I have to say, around October, November 2018. And I'm talking about the years because it takes that long, one, to build up the confidence,
yes,
but also to make sure that what you have to say is relevant for people to hear. That's the big thing for, for any kind of media exposure. Yes, we want exposure for our business and what we're doing and get our name out there. But in the end, the point of doing the media is to reach people outside your immediate community. And so I made a deliberate decision. Hey, I'm ready to reach the world, right? When you think of that in your head, it sounds big and scary. But once you're ready with that first step, then media is the way to go, because that's the way. Traditional media is still, I know social media is the way of the world. We start our day with Instagram and scrolling through Facebook, and social media has a big place in our life now. But traditional media, print and TV is it's still the baseline. Most of us live our lives with the traditional media speaking to us in ways that we don't even consider. And you can reach so many people, and minds and habits can be changed when you connect with people through traditional media.
And I think in the past, traditional media was always viewed as something that you did it and then it disappeared. But even today, so much of, TV segments are available online, sometimes for weeks, sometimes months, sometimes much longer. You see segments from like The Tonight Show and the late night talk shows on YouTube years later. Like they can still be found. And even things like radio interviews can often wind up in a podcast digest that, CBC puts out multiple podcasts every day that are capsule versions of some of their most popular programs and things like that. So even if you do these kinds of events, they're not just one and done. They can live on just as long as a tweet or a Facebook post or a blog post.
Yes, and especially the TV stations. I mean, this is true of all media platforms now. You know how Huffington Post did when it was still the work of Arianna Huffington, how they started connecting people across all various forms of media. TV is doing that in this wonderful way now, where you do the segment and then you have the opportunity to, yes, promote it on your own platforms and connect that TV segment onto your social media. But then all of these stations and programs have their own immense following, and they often promote these segments to their own following in all the various ways, right? I mean, there is that research. We need to hear a message 7 or 8 times before it actually makes an impact in our subconscious. And that's exactly what it is. I mean, it's the reason why all the election candidates buy the airtime on everything, right? Because they need to bombard us with the message.
Very true. And we're all being bombarded right now. Once you made the decision that this was something that you really wanted to do, how did you get started? Because I think that is the I think there's 2 big stepping stones. I think one you touched on already, and that is finding the confidence within. I think for a lot of people, just getting up the nerve to even consider doing television or radio is really nerve-wracking. And then I think if they do get past that and sort of get that confidence and feel that they're ready, like you did, they just don't know where to start. Like, how do you start? How do you just call up the TV station and say, hi, I'd like to be on your show? What?
I think it starts way before that. So once you make that decision in your head, that's a big step for sure. And then the other step is to have the confidence in your content. So in my case, I started writing and telling stories about food and people and my experience as a first-generation immigrant to Canada, and talking about cooking techniques and spices. And so that's how I started out. But over the years, my content kind of evolved into, yes, healthy, delicious, multicultural, diverse, and then also how we can make more sustainable, more green choices. And so I found that my content was following these two streams between food and yumminess and taste and aroma and flavor, and then also the green living. And I found that, yes, there was these many channels of content of the type of stories that I was writing, but I was speaking them in my own voice. I'm trying to articulate this in a way that makes sense to people who don't live in my head.
I guess
sorry.
I was just going to say, I guess maybe an easier way to say it is you need to have developed a strong point of view.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to get out. And a clear one, because that's one of the things when you start pitching to go on someone else's show or TV station, it's like inviting yourself over to someone's home that is beautifully done and is seeing a lot of traffic in terms of they have all these other guests who come on board. And if you're inviting yourself over to someone else's home, you need to know what you're bringing to the party and what the other person can get from you. It's almost like you have this piece of art and you're an artist. Maybe this, I don't know if it confirms what you know, but it's like you have this painting and you'd like to walk into a gallery and tell them, hey, this painting has a place on your walls and here's why.
I think that's true of any pitching. I think whether you're pitching to be on TV or pitching to write for a magazine or pitching to be on somebody's podcast, you have to bring something to the table. That's a great way of saying it. What are you bringing to the party, and why would the other guest care? I guess, for lack of a better, you know, like there has to be something there that is going to be interesting to the host's audience, to their other guests, whether they're actually in the studio or at home watching.
Totally. And what helped me in those early months to clarify my voice and my pitches and to give me the confidence was working with someone who kind of had done it all. I worked with Jennifer Singh of She's Newsworthy Media, who is an amazing source of wisdom, all things related to PR. And she, for a few months, she and I worked together and she held my hand through the first few pitches, helped me clarify that here's what I bring to the party and here's why your audience would care. And also gave me that confidence, because you need a little bit of that. First few times, I came away thinking I should have totally said this differently. And it helps to have someone who's gone through it, who's coaching you to be able to express yourself in a way that makes sense to other people.
Yes.
Outside of your head.
Exactly. We can't all be in Puneeta's head. So sometimes sometimes it helps to have somebody standing there who can hold our hand. And I think that's a really important point to make, because I don't think there's very many people who appear regularly on TV segments or on radio or in print who haven't gone through some kind of media training. I think this is something that doesn't get talked about very much, but it is actually very common for many people to work with a coach or PR professional, and many coaches who work in this field are PR professionals. And in my other business, me and my business partner did go through. We actually went through our PR training with Heather Travis several years ago when she was working for a PR firm, and it was eye-opening for both of us, but so helpful. And even though I've never done TV interviews, going through that training has been incredibly helpful, doing radio interviews and even in print, because I know the one thing that Heather really sort of drummed into our heads is your key messaging. Know your key messaging. Know your key messaging inside out before you get anywhere near that stage or that microphone. And I think that kind of speaks to what you were saying about having a strong point of view. You have to know what it is you want to say, because you don't have very much time to say it.
Oh, that's the other thing, right? You need to get really good at talking fast. And I am a chatty person, so it helps to have a connection with the person on the other side of
Yes.
the table, because you need to stay on point, have the conviction and knowledge that you know what you're talking about, and then also be able to get across in that 4 minutes and 55 seconds, because oftentimes the morning shows, the shows that I have the most experience with, are live and they are under 5 minutes, and they always go by faster than you expect.
Yes, absolutely.
Time
And
flies by.
you have to be prepared because you are live. Like, you don't get a do-over.
Yes.
You don't get to record. If things don't work out, you don't get to re-record it. So, and that, for me, that is the most intimidating part. I don't tend to think very quickly on my feet. And while I might have my key messages in my head, if somebody throws a question at me that I'm not prepared for, that's when I just freeze up. I get very nervous. I stumble over my words, and I feel like I look like an idiot. So, and I think that's a fear that a lot of people have. So I would imagine when you're actually up there on the stage, have you had a few of those moments where you felt like, I can't remember what I was going to say, or I don't know what to say, or I don't know how to answer that? Or are you somebody who finds it very easy to go with the flow?
Oh, I totally don't find it easy to go with the flow. So I'm someone who prepares. So I prepare my script, I practice the timing, and then I also do a dry run, literally a dry run through the segment a couple of times before the segment, before the air date. And then and how that works is that I put the dishes out in front of me, or whatever it is that I'm talking about, in front of me with little post-it notes. And then I decide, okay, how the flow will go and what I will talk about. But the thing is that all of these segments have been with another person. It's not just me yammering away, right? It's a conversation with another person. So you also need to take into account that this is a conversation with someone else, and maybe they're curious about an ingredient that, of course, you haven't thought about preparing, right?
Right.
And so that happens. That happens all the time. I've had a few big total mess ups. But I've also had those messy segments. Then I've had my friends listen to them, sit next to me and listen to this and tell me if I made a fool of myself. And they couldn't tell that I missed what I was supposed to say. And that's the other thing, right? We are often our own biggest critics.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And things may not and things may not go as we plan, but it's still a conversation. And that's one of the big things, that if you can make this into a real conversation and forget about the fact that the camera that's really zooming in on your face or your hands is really zooming in, right? Instead of thinking of that, just think of it as a conversation between two people, and that you're talking about something that you love to talk about or love to create. And to me, that was a big barrier. And once I got over that, it became easier.
I think, too, when you're doing morning segments like this or daytime segments, I would imagine the host, this isn't hard-hitting journalism most of the time. The host isn't trying to trip you up, right?
No.
They want things to go smoothly as well, and they want you to, they want it to look like a fun, interesting segment for their audience. So they're not going to come at you with some crazy question out of left field like they might if this was like an actual interview where it's like a politician or something like that.
Exactly. And it's you're there to present an idea that has already been approved. Yes. And it has been vetted. The stages, the work that goes into, between your pitch and the preparation that the producers do and the script writing that is often done, even for these morning shows, they need to have the script for the hosts. And all of that is work that they've already put in for a segment that they imagine will be successful and will be watched by people. And they're not looking to trip you up. They are looking to get the story behind whatever the visuals it is they're sharing. So as long as you have that and you're able to express that, because that's the other thing, right? Sometimes we freeze up and we're not able to say as much or add as much color as we want. And time runs by fast, totally.
Yes. So let's go back to the beginning. How do you, when you decided that this was something you wanted to do and you got some help with learning the ins and outs of it, how did you actually go through the pitching process? Because it is a little bit different than if you're pitching, say, to write for somebody else or get your product featured in a magazine. Like, I believe with television, you're actually pitching the producer. Is that correct?
Yes.
How do you even know where to find out who the producer is? And, is it different if it's a smaller local cable station as opposed to like a national network program?
Well, the best place to start is often the most obvious, Twitter, social media. Okay. So follow the station and the program that you imagine is a good fit. So one step back is, so my first step often for the beginning of the year, when I plan my calendar for my blog content, I also plan a media calendar.
Very smart. Yeah.
If you can match the two, so if you can match what you want to talk about in media along with your blog, along with your real life, I mean, that is the sweet spot, right? Because then you're creating ideas that would fit in these three buckets. And if you can also feed your family at the end of the day with the same food that you've done the demo of the morning of, perfect. I've done that a few times, and it's such a relief to be able to use all of that food the same day. So dinner, check. But media calendars really help. And they're a good starting point for your own self to figure out, what your big themes are all through the year. And then start figuring out which party you want to be invited to. So is it a program that you watch? Is it a radio show that you listen to when you're driving, or a podcast? So many avenues for places that can fit useful, colorful content on. There are so many opportunities now. And I often start with what I watch. Because for me, my audience is very similar to mine. Families looking out to make healthy, delicious, colorful choices and add a little bit of green living on the way. And so that's how I started. So what are the shows I like to watch? What stations I watch? And then that was my starting point. And then you start connecting with people on social media. Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, they're great places to follow the show and see who's liking the posts. And you can often find the people who are behind the scenes, right, of all of these shows, who will be the ones who decide what stories are shared on that show. Add that to your media calendar, because that media calendar that you started out with is something that you want to refer back to every couple of weeks to see how you're managing your time for the next few months.
Right. I think it's important to note, it hasn't aired yet as we're recording this, but by the time this podcast comes out, an interview that I did with Gabby Payton a few weeks ago about pitching your work as a writer and a journalist is going to be out. And one of the things that she really stressed was that Twitter really is the place to find other journalists and editors of magazines and newspapers. And I think that for a lot of creatives, we've kind of dismissed Twitter as not being a place to be anymore. And I think that's a mistake. If you are looking for any kind of media exposure or access to journalists or editors or any of that kind of thing, you do need to have an active presence on Twitter, and not just spewing out what your latest blog post is or your latest product release is, or you need to kind of engage with, you need to have some conversations on Twitter and pay attention to what those types of people who are in those positions are tweeting. And I think it's a platform that if you're looking to get into this kind of work, you do need to pay attention to. You can't just brush it to the side. In some cases, it might even be more important than Facebook or Instagram, depending on what you do. So Don't ignore Twitter.
I totally agree. No, don't ignore Twitter. And I've actually been on Twitter longer than I've been on any of my other social media.
Yes.
Because that's where I used to get my news from.
Yes.
I still look at the trending topics of the day, and I know, the COVID-19 case numbers and all of that.
Yep.
That instant news that I need, I still get it from Twitter. I also find people are more real on Twitter.
Yes.
It's not as perfect and curated.
It's a very interesting place to see an exchange of ideas. I just watched the vice presidential debate a couple of days ago and followed along on Twitter, and it was it's very entertaining. I mean, there's a lot of people who have very interesting things to say, but it's also actually quite entertaining. So, and I've been on Twitter since I want to say 2008, 2009, like a long time. I know I was definitely still working corporate, and it was very different when it first started out. It really was a place where you had conversations and you could talk to people who you wouldn't normally have access to, and they would reply. And it was a very different platform than it is today. But I still think that core feeling from the early days is still there very much among the news community. So yeah, we don't want to ignore that.
No, and it's also, to your point about being able to talk directly to people, it's also the place that a lot of journalists put out their call outs. So if they're looking for research on a specific story that they're doing, then that's where they tweet out, hey, I'm looking for people to share their story on. That's how one of my first few global news contributions came from Twitter, where there was a call out on celebrating Diwali in a multicultural country like Canada. And this was a couple of years ago. But that's where journalists reach out to the world, and they want to know if there's people with the stories that they're looking for on Twitter.
Yes, and that was one of the things Gabby mentioned. She actually listed several hashtags to follow that journalists tend to use when they're looking for information. And that episode is going to be episode 31 of the podcast. So if you do want to go back and have a listen to that when you're done listening to this episode, if you are a writer or a journalist who is looking to pitch, that's a great episode to go back and listen to. Gabby gave lots of great tips for that. But
she's such a wealth of information.
She is, and she's been on both sides of the desk. She's been the journalist and the writer, and she's also been the editor. So she knows what it's like to pitch, and she knows what it's like to get pitched. So when you're in the pitching process, how do you usually send those pitches? Is it generally via email that you're kind of reaching out, or do you connect first? Like have an actual connection first on Twitter or another social platform? And
it helps to have a connection, because then they know who you are when they see that email. But people get so many emails.
I know.
Yes. And people in media often get many times more emails than people in corporate. And I remember being overwhelmed by my inbox in my corporate life. And folks in media, they are just inundated. So it's often hard to stand out. But what can help you stand out is if they already know your name, right? If they've seen it on Twitter or connected with you on Instagram, then that definitely helps. And email is the best way that I've found. I've heard people do phone calls, and people slide into people's DMs, which I don't do. I'm not a person who slides into anyone's DMs.
I think that's something you have to kind of take a cue from the person you're messaging. I get pitched an awful lot through my other business, and I absolutely hate it when people do it via DM. I hate it. Send me an email. Like
send me an email. Yes, but that's true. And I heard on one of your earlier episodes, you and Heather spoke about how it's great to pick up the phone and call. And I am totally an email person. I'm with you that a phone call is not the first step for me ever.
And yet other people will tell you, they'll be very open about it. And I've heard podcasters do this. I've heard other creatives do this, and they will say, slide into my DM, send me a DM, hit me up in the DMs. And if they're asking you to do that, then do that. That's their preferred way to speak to you. But try and pay a little attention to sort of the cues that you're getting from the person you're trying to connect with.
Yes, totally. And what might work for one person may not work for another person.
Exactly.
Who works for another station. So that brings me to my next point, is that you have to have a thick skin.
Yes.
I take my work very personally, and so a rejection is earth-shattering. And it's taken me a while to figure out that I can't let it bother me, because it may just not be the right time or the right space for it.
I think a lot of creatives struggle with that. We put our heart and soul into the things that we do. And when somebody says no, it can feel like they're saying no to our babies, right?
Yes.
and it took me a long time to get really to the point where I just understood that no doesn't mean that they hate me, they hate my work. It just means no, not right now. And you hear that said over and over again, and it's easy to roll your eyes at it, but it really is true. And I really learned that when I got into a position where I was being pitched constantly or being asked for things constantly. And the person you're talking to can't say yes to everything. If they said yes to everything they got, it would be ridiculous. They have to say no to things, and it has nothing to do with who you are or what you look like or what your work looks like. I mean, sometimes it does, but but for the most part, it's just like, no, this isn't the time for it for us right now. This is not the fit for us right now. This is not we don't have the budget for this right now. There's so many reasons behind that no, and you don't know what they are. And sometimes you can ask, and sometimes that won't get you anywhere, but you really have to stop taking it personally, because otherwise you're going to be curled up in a ball on the floor sobbing.
Yes.
All the time.
And you may, I've done that. And then I've gone on to binge watching Grey's Anatomy to get over the anguish. But you have to, so that takes me back to step one, right? To have the conviction in your voice and your work, to be able to go back and knock on that door again and again.
Yes.
Because what can also happen is that you hear the no and the rejection. But the other thing that happens so many more times is that you don't hear anything at all. It's just silence. So you've made the effort, you've knocked on that first door or your 10th, and nobody's opened the door, and you don't know, did they hear it? Did they read it? Did they reject it? Or did they just miss it?
Yes.
And most likely they missed it, because again, their inboxes, everybody's inboxes are inundated. It's often not a rejection. It's just that they didn't get to it and the time passed.
Yeah. Or they got to it and they forgot, or they just, there's so many reasons. And
there's so many reasons. And then that just goes back to that, if you have the strength of conviction that you heard silence and you heard a bunch of no's, and you just keep doing this because you know it's the right next step on this path that you're building for yourself, because that's what we're doing, right? We're just creating this ourselves.
You persist. She persisted.
Yes.
That's a very common phrase right now. She persisted.
Yes. It's like those Marvel movies. You left off the cliff, and then the path to Asgard kind of formulates in front of you. This is just me.
Yes. I know exactly what you mean.
Yes.
It's Indiana Jones as well, where he's going to
Yes, Indiana Jones as well. Yes. Oh my God, right.
So you send your pitches out into the world, and you get a response, and it's a yes. We'd love to have you come on the show. I would imagine if that happened to me, I would have a panic attack, because now I actually have to do this. But what are your next steps? What happens next once you get the yes?
Then you start envisioning how you would actually do the segment, because you need to follow up. The pitch is often an outline.
Right.
And you follow up with, here's exactly how it's going to go. Here's what we will talk about. I'll have 3 cups of tea and I will talk through each cup of tea, and here's what I will say. You move from an outline to, so imagine it's the fill in the color kind of a picture with the outline, and
Right.
that's what the pitch is. And then you need to actually fill in the color. And then if you're talking about something, which I often am with the sustainability, then I will link to some research that has come out, or single-use plastic is this, and this is how bad it is. So if you send all of that information to the producer with what the demo or what the segment will exactly look like, then you're making the producer's life a little easier, right? They don't have to Google it and figure out how many people are really concerned about this part of life. Or if you're cooking with cinnamon, then cinnamon is good for cold weather, flu symptoms, for this and that reason. So it makes the producer's life a whole lot easier. And you want to do that because you want them to enjoy working with you and then call you back, right?
Yes. And I hadn't thought of that, but I would think that linking to some kind of backup material that shows that this is something that is either a trending topic right now, or that has some scientific research behind it, or something that can make it. We've talked about this before on the podcast. You're connecting the dots for them, like that we should be talking about this because this has been in the news a lot lately, or this research came out and this is, connect the dots all the way back for them so they can see why, yeah, this is a good fit. We should do this.
And why they should, have you have your painting on that wall, because they have 10,000 people coming. And do those 10,000 people really care about what you have to say? And yes, you have the research that shows that a lot of people care about this stuff. A lot of us are going through the same thing, and this will speak to your audience.
So I think you really have to have a different mindset shift when you're doing this, because it's one thing to create recipes on your blog or make jewelry or provide social media services, all those kinds of things. Like, it can be really hard to kind of think about how could I make this relevant for a television audience. And so in the case, you figured that out, but say in the case of somebody who provides social media or branding services, say you're a graphic designer, you might be sitting there thinking, I don't really see any way that I could contribute anything to a TV segment. But I think if you are able to show that you're an expert in these things, you can. There's always segments that come up where they're asking questions about something that's going on, some kind of trend. It could be a tech trend. It could be, maybe if you're doing branding, it could be something about how more businesses are starting to see the importance of sustainability or green living, and you could come on as an expert in how small businesses can present themselves to the world and give some tips or something like that. So I'm just spewing this off the top of my head, but I think you do have to kind of have a shift in your mind as to how can I take what I do and show the world that it's relevant to what's going on in today's society, and how it could be useful to somebody. I have a friend that I went to university or to high school with, and now she is an oceanographer expert. But she often appears on the news as the expert when they're talking about things like ocean currents. And I think she was interviewed when that plane that went down that they couldn't find.
Yes.
And she was interviewed about ocean currents and where the debris could potentially have wound up. And so, she's not somebody that you would initially think would be on TV, but she was an expert in what they needed to talk about. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you could find a niche or a groove that could get you onto something like this. So, in the case of Lisa, she was promoting a book, but she was able to take that book and show the audience how you could have a great party by buying my book,
Yep.
So
On the boards, it's one of my favorite visual books. I mean, the pictures are beautiful.
And I mean, let's be honest, she was on there because she wanted to sell more copies of her book. Like, that's the reason she was there. But that's not why she went on The View or on The Social and said, I want to sell my book. Like, let's sell as many copies as we can. She was on there to just show the audience, like, hey, this is how you can create a really fun way to entertain at home this holiday season without a lot of fuss and effort. Boom, right? And by the way, buy my book.
Totally. Yes. And that goes back to my, I wear a number of hats, and my career was marketing strategy and planning. And one of the things we learned as students was figure out the why. And that's so true here, that why should the other person care? Why does the producer care? Why should people watch you? Yeah. In Lisa's case, it's because we all want to figure out how to throw an easy party. And if we can figure out how to do these grazing boards, how amazing is that?
Exactly. So it had value for the audience of those programs, and it was a good fit. Once you get on there, though, once you get your first gig, you're going out there. How do you start prepping? You've kind of talked a little bit about it, but what are sort of the things that you have to watch out for when you know that you're going to be appearing on TV? Because I know it's more than just what you say. I know that the clothing choices you make play a role. I know that you are often the person who is going to have to prep especially for you, because I know you do some cooking demos. And contrary to popular belief, you don't generally have a big crew helping you set up.
No, you often have no crew. So especially today, I mean, nowadays the teams have become smaller. So you're broadcasting often from home, and that adds another layer of complexity in that you have to clean your kitchen, right? Your kitchen is going to be on TV.
and you have to hope that your tech works as well when you're at home, which is something you're not responsible for in the studio.
Yes. And you want to make all effort to have all of these little bits and pieces work right, because what I'm doing or what somebody else is doing is one piece of a much bigger machine. And if one of the segments is, if it's glitchy or a mess, or the Wi-Fi isn't right, or it doesn't look right, like it belongs on the rest of the show, then it makes the show producers look bad. And you're there to support their work. You're, of course, I'm there to, of course, spread my own message in a selfish way, but I'm also there to support the show. And if I make a mess of it, then I'm not, right? So
you want to be invited back,
right? Yes, and also you want to watch the show. Like, I literally, if I'm going on a show, I will binge watch, because as we talked about, you can find all of the old segments of everything online. And so when I was confirmed for The Social, I went and watched every food and lifestyle segment that has ever been on Social that is now shared on their website. And I wanted to get a feeling of the energy and how the conversation runs between the hosts, because it's often one or two or three hosts with the guest. And there is a back and forth, which I love, because it's a real conversation, right? They want to know what you're doing and share that with the audience. And so I went back and watched every show segment, every lifestyle and food segment that I could get my hands on. And that gave me a good idea, even though nowadays with COVID, a lot of these shows have had to pivot on the way they share content. It's been a whole different thing over the summer. Yes. So, but you want to be really familiar with the show or the station format before you actually go on it.
Exactly, because as you mentioned, on a show like The Social, where the hosts all have very different viewpoints, that's not something you would want to walk into cold. You want to know You want to know their personalities before you have to interact with them.
Yes, you want to know them a little bit. And that line is quite blurred, I have to say, because sometimes I research people so much that I feel that I know them, and I don't, right? I've just been stalking them online. But that line does get blurred but you need to figure out who you're talking to, because the chance to have that conversation is really short.
Yes.
And if you go in with knowledge and preparation, then it helps with my nerves for sure.
Yes, I'm the same way. I'm somebody who likes to know how everything is going to move. That goes a long way to making me feel much calmer. Just everything from like going to the dentist to, doing something I've never done before. It's just, I like people to tell me what the steps are. Like, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. And then, and then I'm fine. So whatever you need to do, because we're all different, to make yourself feel more comfortable is absolutely, you want to make sure that you do that. So we were talking about this the other day when we were doing some prep for this, but what are some of the things you've learned over the last year and a half with doing your TV work that you wish you had known beforehand? I know you've picked up a few things that were by experience.
Yes. So the one thing I learned is that if you have the choice of date, then don't book yourself on a day after a huge global national event, because I was booked to talk about Diwali the day after the Canadian elections. And the morning show that I was at it was such a messy day for them, because they had all these experts on, and there was a little bit of it was a mess. And there I was with my beautiful Diwali table, and everybody was handling it so well. The show was chaotic, but so interesting, because that's what life is, right?
Yes.
But then there I was with my little fireworks and my pulcheries and wanting to talk about Diwali, and it totally did not go as I planned. But I had the opportunity to talk about other things, politics and green living and everything else, but not so much Diwali.
So yes, if you have the opportunity to choose your dates, try not to choose a date after a national or provincial election, or
or maybe an international, global something or the other that's going on, right?
Yes,
but there's always something going on.
Obviously, there's news things that come up that we have no control over, but something like an election, when the day after an election is going to be. So
yes. And my other piece of advice would be to see how the hour before especially for live shows. So see how, if you're going in at 8 a.m., then just go on Twitter the hour before and see what's going on in the world. Because oftentimes the segue from whatever is happening before to your segment is quite close. And that transition sometimes is blurred if there's been an accident on the freeway or something else that really matters at a local or a national level. So just go on Twitter and see how that show has been progressing in the last hour, especially if it's a longer show. I mean, the morning shows are often 2-3 hours long. So you kind of get the feel of how the mood has been. If there's something going on that's taking all the focus, then you need to be prepared to just quickly talk about it if needed.
That's a really good tip, actually.
Or at least to have it in the back of... it's because there's always... I find the news cycle is so dynamic right now. It's good to go in with an awareness of what the energy will be.
Yeah.
And then you can manage it, right?
I think that's a really good tip, because I think a lot of us probably default to being in our own little bubble before we go on to something like this, because we're nervous. We're going through our checklist in our head of, do we have everything? Am I, how am I going to do this? But so we may not think to actually be aware of what is going on around us. I would think too, it's also a good idea to just go in prepared with what's going on in the world in general, news-wise, in the last few days before your segment, just so that you kind of know what they might be talking about.
Yes, because I often, in the past, I used to do my Instagram stories at that time. So I would be broadcasting and sharing, but not as much listening to what's going on. And I've changed that in the last 6-7 months because, of course, yes, things are now, I feel as if there's something going on all the time, and it helps me to have an understanding, right? Yeah, 2020.
There's always something going on. So that was going to be one of my other questions is when something unexpected does happen, particularly if you're on the air at that point, do you have any tips for how to handle that? We mentioned a little earlier, you had a few incidents where you felt like you kind of looked silly. Your friends told you they couldn't even tell. What do you do in those instances? Just take some deep breaths or what kind of keep?
What helps me is to have eye contact with the host. So it was hard the first couple of times during these COVID times where I don't go into studio, but the eye contact and to have that connection with the host, with the anchor, it really helps because they're there to have a conversation with you and the TV is there to share that conversation with other people. So the cameras are there to capture that conversation and share it. And if you think of it as a conversation before you think of the cameras, then it helps because in the end, it is, if we were talking to a real person in real time about something that mattered to us, then the back and forth would be less stressful, right? If we could forget about the cameras. So what if we just did and we thought of it as a dinner time conversation, except that we're looking great and we're being really articulate. And we haven't had a drink.
That's a great tip because I think we've all had those one-on-one conversations where, the person you're talking to is kind of, their eyes are flicking all over the place and they're looking over your shoulder and it's really distracting. But when you can have that, and that's kind of what a camera can be like, it's just that distraction. It's kind of like, but if you can really focus and get that person to focus on you and you're sort of focusing on each other and just having a conversation. I tell people who come on the podcast that all the time. We're just having a conversation. It's just you and me. There's nobody else here and nobody else is listening to us right now. They're not going to listen to us till later. So we're just chatting. Okay. So we are coming up on the end of the hour, which means we're coming up on the end of the episode. And before we wrap up, Puneeta, is there anything else that you just want to add to the conversation or kind of summarize before we sign off?
Well, media has given me so much of opportunity, right? To reach people who I wouldn't have been able to reach through Maple and Marigold. And so the avenue for expansion, for creating content and then reaching into people's living rooms with that content, media is right for that. What I also find, though, is that it took me a while to, because when I started on this journey a few years ago, it took me a while to build momentum. And then that momentum is, you need that momentum to be able to keep going because it is a hard road. Again, I'm going down the hard road. This is like this hard. Oh.
Well, I think it is a hard road. I mean, I don't think there are very many people who just wake up and are naturals on television. I think for a lot of people, it really is. It's
learning curve instead of a hard.
Absolutely, it's a learning curve, and it's. I think for a lot of people, they need to get the confidence to be able to do this, which is a bit of a process. And it's like when we had Angelina on the show, she said that one of the hardest things for her when she started to do video was that she had to learn how to be a beginner again. And that really resonated with me because I think when we've been doing something for a long time and we've become relatively successful with it, it starts to feel easy. And so whenever we decide we want to try something new or go down a new road or expand our opportunities, for a lot of us, that means starting fresh and we're the newbie. And there's a lot of fear and anxiety that goes with that and a lack of self-confidence. And we have to kind of learn how to build ourselves back up again and remind ourselves that this is the first time I'm doing this. The second time will be, I have to get the first one out of the way in order to do the second one. And it's a process. I'm sure that at this point you are much more comfortable being on television than you were that very first time.
Oh, totally. Yes.
So
I think I got an extra 10, 15 gray hair just after that first segment.
And I think that's something that's important to remember, because I know doing something like this for a lot of people really is a very scary prospect. I know for me, it's terrifying. And so I think that's an important thing to remember. And I think one of the things you said earlier in the interview that I think people who are listening are probably really resonating with is that you really have to figure out what that strong point of view is that you have. And in your case, you're very passionate about what you do. You're passionate about sustainability. You are passionate about food, and you are passionate about expanding people's cultural horizons. And you found a way to be able to speak about that you wouldn't have had otherwise.
I love that, expanding people's. I'm writing it down. Cultural horizons.
There you go, everyone. We just put it all together right there.
Yes.
So I think in the show notes, everyone, we'll leave a link to Jennifer Singh's company. So for those of you who are thinking...
she's newsworthy.
Yes. For those of you who are thinking that this is something you'd like to do and you'd like to get a little extra help, there are several other media coaches out there. If you have contacts in the PR world, reach out to them, ask them if that's a service they provide, if there's somebody that you're comfortable with. I think for me, I would really want to kind of find that person that I have a comfort level with, but also look in your niche. I know Puneeta and I a lot of what we do is in the blogging world, and there are a lot of bloggers, and particularly in the health and wellness field, who also offer media coaching services. So there's help out there if this is something that you want to do, and you need somebody to kind of hold your hand and help you get through those first few and sort of guide you and help you with your pitches. So that's something that you can absolutely do. And before we wrap up, Puneeta, where can people find you on the World Wide Web?
Well, the best way to find me is to stalk me on Instagram, on Maple and Marigold, and Facebook as well. I have a community on Facebook where I often share things that I don't share on the blog. And the blog is mapleandmarigold.com. And you can also sign up for the newsletter. I've started sending out these monthly, here's what's going on in the community, and it's been a wonderful journey. And if you really like cooking from your pantry, I have an ebook that is specifically for people to help them how to shop your pantry. That's the name. And all donations, all the proceeds from the sales of that cookbook go towards supporting Second Harvest Canada.
Oh, that's a wonderful organization. We'll put a link to all of those.
They're doing wonderful work.
They are.
That would be awesome.
We'll put links to all of that in the show notes so you can grab Puneeta's ebook and you can learn a little bit more about what Second Harvest does. And you also have your website, Nourish by Numbers, which we'll also leave a link to. And I think we're going to try and leave some links to a few of the segments that you have done that are available so people can see you in action. So we'll
that would be wonderful, because then it gives people an idea of, the kind of work you can do.
Yeah.
If you go down this road towards media, right?
Yes, absolutely. So we'll leave some links to some of those things. And if your social appearance has happened by the time this episode comes out, we'll leave a link to that as well. Thank you so much, Puneeta. This was a really helpful episode. I think I learned a lot, and I think anybody who is interested in expanding their horizons with media appearances will find this really useful.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for having me. This was a great conversation.
It was a lot of fun. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I will be back with you all next week. Thank you so much for joining us for the And She Looked Up Creative Hour. If you're looking for links or resources mentioned in this episode, you can find detailed show notes on our website at andshelookedup.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for our newsletter for more business tips, profiles of inspiring Canadian creative women, and so much more. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to the show via your podcast app of choice so you never miss an episode. We always love to hear from you, so we'd love it if you'd leave us a review through iTunes or Apple Podcasts. Drop us a note via our website at andshelookedup.com or come say hi on Instagram at andshelookedup. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.